Hello, and welcome everyone to A Burst AI Bubble is Only the Beginning, Dangerous Finance and Sources of Crisis, the first event in Americans for Financial Reform Education Fund's new speaker series. We're really happy to have you here. Today, we're joined by Hilary J. Allen, professor at the American University Washington College of Law, and Oscar Valdés Viera, Americans for Financial Reform Education Fund's private equity and capital markets policy analyst. And I'm Ericka Taylor, one of AFREF's co-executive directors. So before we get started, a little light housekeeping. We're leaving space for audience questions near the end of the webinar, but you can add questions using the Q&A button at any time. Also, thanks to all of you who submitted questions in advance, and please understand that we will unfortunately not have the time to answer all of the questions submitted in advance or asked in today's session. Finally, while there are many disturbing aspects to crypto, from its threat to workers, the environment, civil rights, and more, today we're going to zero in and look at the risks posed to our financial system by the AI bubble and the behind-the-scenes financing that we should be worried about. And without further ado, let's dig in. First, Hillary, your first question is for you. How would you describe what is going on with AI now, starting from the basics? And what are some of the externalities created by its massive growth?
Sure. Well, if we're starting with the basics, let me start with what AI is, because there's a lot of confusion about that. AI is a marketing term. AI is not intelligent. It's not capable of reasoning. It has no original thought because these tools aren't capable of thought. These tools just detect statistical patterns in the data presented to them, and then they proceed according to those patterns. So the sci-fi author Ted Chiang said that a better name for this stuff would be applied statistics, and I concur. But that doesn't have the marketing hype, and we're going to talk about hype a lot today. So AI is a marketing term. It's also not sort of a coherent marketing term. There's lots of different kinds of technologies that count as AI. And some of them have been around for decades and do a pretty good job, although you have to be aware of their data limitations. Often the data is sort of biased and creates problems, but there are tools that do quite well. But my focus today is on Gen AI, generative AI, particularly text generation. So these tools are trained on large swathes of the internet to predict the most statistically likely set of words that respond to a given prompt. Of course, the statistically most likely set of words can be spectacularly wrong or entirely fabricated. One widely cited independent study from 2024 found that even the best models generate hallucination-free text only about 35% of the time. So 65% of the time, you're going to have problems. The original hype was that these tools would get more accurate over time. Increasingly, scholars and even some in the industry have conceded that this is likely as good as it's going to get in terms of accuracy. In fact, they could very well get worse as they start getting trained on more of the internet that has been filled with AI-generated content, which is filled with hallucinations. And the technical term for this AI-generated content is slop. So you'll hear me talk about slop a few times. So externalities, you said. Let me count the ways. The one that's gotten the most play probably are the data centers and their environmental impact, and also their impact on the energy costs for local environments. There is the theft of copyrighted material, including my own work. And this is something that is just an integral part of these models. I'm going to quote from Andreessen Horowitz, a venture capital firm that's very involved in this space. They said, the bottom line is this: imposing the cost of actual or potential copyright liability on the creators of AI models will either kill or significantly hamper their development. So copyright theft is a feature, not a bug. Some things that have flown a little bit beneath the radar is that, this technology is billed as automation, but in fact, so many people were involved in making it. Often people in foreign countries who are paid very little money, like $2 an hour, to prepare the data to train these models. Some of the stuff that they were exposed to was very traumatic. So there's all kinds of concerns about that kind of labor creating the models. Most of the conversation about labor we've heard with Gen AI is it going to replace our jobs in the US? And I will come back to that later. Another problem that's starting to get more traction or more conversation, but I think not everybody is aware of, is that using these tools impair critical thinking. So I'm going to read you a quote from the law faculty at the University College of London, who said that students who learn primarily to act as passive conduits for AI-produced information, regardless of whether they check its veracity, are not going to reach the potential they have to even use the tool well, let alone the much broader potential they have as independent thinkers. Unsurprisingly, when people outsource their thinking to a tool, their critical thinking skills don't develop. And yet we are shoving this into education. It is being pushed to kids and young adults, even though these tools have induced psychosis and even suicide. This has been getting a lot of media attention lately. I should note that, people honestly shouldn't be surprised that the companies that are pushing these tools don't necessarily care that much about these kinds of externalities. Remember that these are the very same companies often that are the social media companies who have, we've had a lot of conversation about the content moderation there and the challenges in holding anyone accountable for the negative impacts of those models. I mean, it's really important to emphasize in this vein that technology is never neutral. It's always encoded with the values of the people who create it and deploy it. And honestly, the prevalence of anti-democratic and eugenicist even ideologies among the leaders of some of these AI companies, also their overly simplistic embrace of sci-fi, science fiction as a roadmap, that should just make us skeptical of their offerings. So I've been talking for a while. Let me just quickly list a few more sets of externalities. AI is being used to juice scams, create misinformation. As I said, it's polluting the internet with slop. Bad content drives out good content. It's perverting our political processes to some degree with crony capitalism. I'll say more about that later. And of course, the AI bubble might cause a financial crisis, which is what we're here to talk about. So I'll hand over to Oscar if he's got anything else to say, or to you, Ericka.
Thank you. Thank you for that really disturbing but helpful answer. Oscar, would you like to add anything?
Um, that was very comprehensive, so I don't have a lot. Just, when we were talking about externalities, one thing that I cannot avoid thinking is just the environmental costs and the expected energy needs that AI have, and the massive climate impact that that's going to have. And we're seeing that a lot of planned investment in gas plants, and that's going to take a lot of sunk costs. That's going to lock dependency into these fossil fuels, and for a long time, when at a time when we need to be moving on from fossil fuels and into renewables. But yeah, and also I just wanted to take a second to thank everyone for participating, and thank you, Professor Allen, for being here today.
Thank you. Thank you both. So, Professor Allen, the next question is also for you. You mentioned as you were responding to the last question, the concerns about a bubble. So, why do so many people think we may already be in an AI bubble?
Yeah, and when we say so many people, we're talking about people ranging from Fed Reserve Chair Jay Powell to the head of OpenAI, Sam Altman, who've all conceded that there's some kind of AI bubble going on, although they may have very different views on what kind of bubble it is and what its consequences are likely to be. But when we talk about bubbles, I think it's helpful to go back to Shiller's work on the economist Schiller on irrational exuberance and sort of how bubbles grow. And one of the things that he emphasizes about how these bubbles work is that it's all about the stories that we tell, right? Good stories draw in new investors who push prices up in a way that seems to validate those stories. So I'm going to quote a little bit from his book, Irrational Exuberance. He says, despite doubts about the real value of the investment, people are drawn to it partly through envy of others' successes and partly through a gambler's excitement. But stories can work both ways, and bubbles burst when stories start to become negative and sellers, through their sales, push down the prices, validating the negative opinions, and then people keep selling, etc. So I'm going to talk about the upswing right now. Let's talk about the good stories that are being used to hype generative AI. So the tech journalist Brian Merchant has summarized the narratives being told this way. He says that we're told that AI will soon be able to do just about anything a human can do and will usher in an age of super powerful technology, the likes of which we can only begin to imagine. Jobs will be automated, industries transformed, cancer cured, climate change solved. AI will do quite literally everything. So that's the pitch. AI is a bit like a blank canvas on which to project your hopes, dreams, and nightmares. And so it's not surprising that AI stories have captured the public imagination, but that doesn't mean that those stories are true. I want to note that when I was talking about my discussion of externalities just before, I didn't mention human extinction. This is not a thing that applied statistics can do. Unless, I guess, to Oscar's previous point, if data centers bring about climate change that make the planet uninhabitable for us, then maybe we've got human extinction going on. But there's nothing intelligent about these statistical modeling tools. And so the Terminator narratives of dangerous superintelligence, they're all ginned up to make AI seem more powerful than it actually is. Another story that we get told about AI that has helped inflate the AI bubble is this inevitability narrative. I know, Ericka, you mentioned we're not talking about crypto today, but we have seen a similar narrative about inevitability with crypto. This idea that technological progress is going to happen regardless. So what I would point out to you is that nothing is inevitable. We could always use the law to channel the development of tech-based business models to mitigate their externalities if we wanted to. We could even ban them if we wanted to. And the tech companies know this. And that's why they spend so much time and money on lobbying for special legal treatment. But even without legal intervention, and we're unlikely to see that during a Trump administration, even without legal intervention, technological progress is not inevitable. People often think that tech advances can essentially be willed into existence, that we'll eventually get there if we just keep plugging away and throwing more money at the same technology for long enough. The reality is, though, that technology is not magic, and there are some obstacles it cannot overcome. So we should treat the AI industry's narrative claims with extreme skepticism, especially given that subject matter experts are all shouting to the rafters that AI simply cannot solve their problems in their fields, and ditto on crypto, by the way. So there's the inevitability narrative. There's also the jobs narrative, which I said I'd come back to. So I'm going to quote again venture capitalist Mark Andreessen of Andreessen Horowitz, who says that AI will be doing all the jobs in the future except for venture capital, which he says may be one of the last remaining fields that people are still doing. So enjoy that hubris for a second and then put it aside. It's something that is not actually controversial to say, and I think is quite well supported, but it is rarely said, is that almost every prompt loses these AI companies money. And AI companies are significantly subsidizing the use of these tools at present. That's why they're burning through so much funding. So the question is there really a compelling story that this will get rid of all the jobs, that this will be a profitable business in the end? A little bit of water was thrown on this story with a recent MIT report that said that despite companies investing $30 to $40 billion in AI tools, their report found the surprising result to them, not so surprising to me, that 95% of all organizations using AI are getting zero return on that 30 to 40 billion of investment into AI tools. And remember, this is during a period when Gen AI are heavily subsidizing the use of these tools. Goldman Sachs' Jim Covello said, historically, we've always had a very cheap solution replacing a very expensive solution. But here you have a very expensive solution that's meant to replace low-cost labor. And that just doesn't make any sense from the jump. So I think it's too early and unrealistic to say that AI is going to kill all the jobs. Where AI is costing jobs already is in creative industries. So our society is often undervalued creative output, And the bosses in those industries are making a bet that we'll be happy enough with AI generated slop that they can stop paying creatives entirely or just hire them as freelancers to fix the slop. There's this sense of precarity that AI is creating among workers, which is useful for some bosses. I think the tech commentator Cory Doctorow said it best. The AI can't do your job, but an AI salesman can convince your boss to fire you and replace you with a chatbot that also can't do your job. So there is, I don't want to say that there's no threat to jobs, but it's coming from political economy and narratives, not the technical capabilities of this technology. And once this funding that's subsidizing the use of Gen AI tools disappears, then it will probably be cheaper to just pay people to do the work themselves, especially because people actually learn to get better at their jobs that way. So we're starting to see some cracks in this narrative about inevitability, about it taking all our jobs. We're starting to see more questions about how much are people really willing to pay AI companies for mistake-riddled first drafts. And we're also starting to see, in terms of more negative stories, eye-popping numbers from the AI industry about the type of funding it's going to need for a very long time. These are starting to threaten the good narrative of the AI bubble and starting to substitute a more panicked narrative. Another common characteristic of bubbles is shady accounting practices disguised by narrative and hype. We're increasingly seeing questions raised in the press about the true costs of responding to prompts, something that AI companies have been really quite cagey about, but outsiders are starting to piece together the puzzle. Then you have people like the Big Short famed Michael Burry talking about flawed depreciation accounting that overstate the useful life of chips being used by these models. So yeah, to sum up, a bubble is really a story, and we've been telling a good story, but it's starting to feel like the bad story is, and to that end, the more realistic story is starting to take over.
Thank you for that. And I'm wondering, is there any? Are you seeing any similarities in the narratives about cryptocurrencies that we putting AI into cryptocurrency narratives we saw a few years ago?
Well, and that we honestly continue to see about crypto, right? There are vast overstatements of what the technology can actually achieve. We're seeing narratives about inevitability. We're seeing narratives about, don't regulate us because you'll squash our potential, even though, as I said, like both things can't be true. You can't be inevitable and also need favorable legal treatment in order to succeed. And we're also going to see we're also seeing similarities in terms of the lobbying playbooks, the super PAC playbooks, and we shouldn't be surprised because it's the same people. Andreessen Horowitz, the venture capital industry, essentially built the crypto industry up, and they are also one of the leading investors in the AI industry, or in AI startups. So we shouldn't be surprised to see similarities.
Thank you, Professor Allen. I'm going to turn to Oscar next. Oscar, what makes this bubble that Professor Allen was just talking about potentially more dangerous than, say, regular bubbles in equity markets? And also, I'd love to hear your thinking about why does it matter to people not invested in big tech stocks?
Thank you. So I think you're right. It doesn't look simply like a stock bubble where one company or several companies are overvalued and their stock price is inflated. It looks a lot more than that. And this is about how deeply AI hype is now embedded in the whole economy and within the plumbing of the financial system. I think this AI bubble differs fundamentally from other equity bubbles in at least three factors. One is the unprecedented concentration that we're seeing in just a few tech companies. The other one would be that AI and this, investment boom is basically propping up a weak economy. And the last one would be most concerning, and why we're here today, is that there is increasingly use of debt, particularly private credit that creates interconnections between what's going on in Silicon Valley, Wall Street, and Main Street. So I'll try to say a few words about each of those, three issues. Like the concentration is something that we haven't seen before, really. We have these magnificent 7 technology stocks and a few, AI adjacent companies that have a market capitalization of over $20 trillion, I think, as of the end of September. And now they account for over a third of the total value of all S&P 500 stocks and over 2/3 of all the returns of the S&P since 2022. So as as a lot of analysts have been saying, this means the entire stock market basically depends on AI delivering the massive returns that would justify those valuations. And if these companies their value fall, it's it won't fall alone. It will take the whole market with them. So the second issue I mentioned of probably in a weak economy, there is a lot of uncertainty, a lot of chaos right now in the economy, mainly coming from the White House, to be honestly, and people dealing with a cost of living crisis, with stagnant wages, and a lot of problems in the economy. And on top of that, there are signs of the deteriorating labor market. So, some estimates put the investment in data centers and software processing technology accounting for almost all of US GDP growth in the first half of 2025. So that means that these investments, if they don't pan out and turn out the market valuation, and turns out that the market valuations were built on, were sandcastles, then the whole economy is on the hook. It means that, you don't have to own NVIDIA stock to feel the heat if the whole economy slows down. The third thing I mentioned is most important for financial stability is the leverage that's being built throughout the financial system. At the start of the AI boom, and even earlier this year, the big tech companies were financing their AI projects mostly using cash they had on hand. But recently, AI companies have been issuing a lot of debt, over $1 trillion of investment grade bonds. And on top of that, there is a huge expansion of lending by so-called private credit funds and the financial. And we're seeing a lot of the financial instruments that became famous or infamous in 2008 really having a comeback. And those are like the special purpose vehicles that keep debt off the balance sheet of companies. And there is like packaging of debt into mortgage-backed securities and taking insurance using credit default swaps. All those things that like really give a throwback to 2007, 2008. And banks are also on the hook. A lot of the private credit that companies like private equity firms are a lot of the lending that they are doing is tied up to banks. The banks lend to these private equity companies, which then in turn are financing the AI infrastructure boom. And so the leverage is layered and it's indirect, and a lot of it sits in really opaque private markets where assets are often valued with what we call mark to make believe models, where rather than real market prices, because these are assets that are not traded often. So investors and regulators really have limited visibility into these funds, and the problems or the losses can be hidden for a while. Why does it matter to people not invested in big stocks? The role of private equity, for example, matters a lot here, even to those who are not invested in AI or tech companies. Regular people are deeply exposed to these companies. So, for example, private credit funds get some of their funding from banks, like I said, but they also get a lot of their money from workers' pension funds. So there's a lot of money from teachers, firefighters, fueling this AI boom. And soon it could also be 401ks if the administration gets away with what they're trying to do right now. Private equity have also bought a lot of insurance company, and these insurance companies have been taking a lot of the private debt instruments. So that's another way where regular people's money is on the line. So basically, the premiums we pay on our car insurance, our home insurance, our life insurance, retirement products like annuities, it's going to inflate in this bowl. And basically our pension funds are likely to be lending to private credit firms that are financing data centers. Our insurance companies are holding billions of AI related debt. And, in 401ks, even if they're still not going into private equity, 401ks are likely invested in at least the Magnificent Seven, the Google, Facebook, or, Meta, Apple, and so on. So, yeah, in short, like, we're letting this highly leveraged speculation be built on top of regular people's savings and on top of our livelihood. So, and if the bubble pops, then the damage won't stay just confined to Silicon Valley or just to Wall Street. It will spread out to all of us.
Thank you, Oscar. I really appreciate what you've had to say about the precarity of the situation. You talked a bit about sort of some of the funding that is propping up, and I use that term advisedly, propping up AI. Could you dig a little bit more into what happens if the bubble bursts, right? What are the implications for a recession or even for financial stability writ large?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. I think, we first need to go a little bit into the stack of debt and leverage that is being built and running from public bond markets through banks and deep into the shadow banking system of private credit and private funds. So, these private credit funds there's a lot of opacity in these markets, and that virtually guarantees that any potential losses are going to be both larger and more widespread than anticipated if reality or expectations fails to materialize about expectations about the return on investments from these AI investments fail to materialize. So the debt now is becoming really, really large. The largest segment of investment grade debt market is at $1.2 trillion. And that's just the more visible, the visible bonds that are traded from these companies. The real danger lies in the financing mechanisms designed to hide the leverage and to basically avoid regulation. So first, private credit has exploded to fill some of the void or some of the funding that banks are not doing. So the private credit industry has grown to over $2 trillion with firms like Apollo, KKR, Blackstone making direct loans, largely exempt from a lot of the banking safety and soundness regulations that were put in place after the 2008 financial crisis. And these funds lend to mid-sized companies. They lend to the data centers developers, and like I said before, they draw their funding from banks, but also from pension funds, from insurers, and from accredited investors, which are really wealthy investors. So the banks have extended trillions of dollars in commitments and loans to these private credit funds. So those exposures have grown really, really fast over the last few months. And meanwhile, the borrowers, companies like OpenAI, are burning through piles of cash. According to the Wall Street Journal, the OpenAI made a $12 billion loss just last quarter. And they soon will have to pay or $60 billion, I think, a year for cloud infrastructure just to Oracle. So, the problem is it's not just the loans themselves, it's who bears the risk and where does the private credit firms are getting their money, like I said. So, soon a lot of ordinary people are going to be on the line, and for funding potentially, really risky ventures. And the way the bubble burst, and obviously I'll let Professor Allen talk a little bit more about this, because she had a really great article recently on Project Syndicate. But what we could see is just debt and contagion spreading throughout the system. We can see AI companies defaulting, which would make big losses for the private credit funds, and then the pension funds and the insurance companies would face massive losses. The banks that lend to those institutions would face defaults. Margin calls would force fire sales. Asset prices will collapse, and then suddenly we are in a full-blown, debt deflation or financial crisis. So, and like I said, regulators have very little visibility into the risks that are in these private funds, and some of that is intentional, to be honest. We are talking about a choice that regulators are doing to not guard these risks, and to not enforce rules and regulations that are already in place that could give them some of the data and some of the information they need to monitor this. And I'll stop there for a second and let Professor Allen jump in if he wants.
Yes, please. Yeah, I think that's a really comprehensive discussion of a lot of the problems we're having. And I think you've really honed in on the key problem here, is that our entire system is rife with leverage. And if you're not familiar with leverage, what leverage means is you're funding your investments with borrowed money rather than with your own equity, your own cash, essentially. And what that means is if the value of your assets sort of falls, then you may not be able to repay your debt. So when we have a whole system that's rife with leverage, we have the problems that Oscar just identified, where sort of the AI companies themselves may end up defaulting on loans. He mentioned that we're starting to see increasing interest in bond issuances by these companies, so they may default themselves. Then, however, we also have to look at the amount of leverage in the stock market, the people who have bought these stocks. So hedge funds, for example, record high crowding into Magnificent Seven tech stocks, as Oscar mentioned, record high leverage at hedge funds. Some of that money they've borrowed directly from banks. Some of it they've borrowed from broker dealers and other non-bank financial institutions, but then they ultimately have borrowed that money from banks. So what that means is if stock prices fall and the hedge funds are unable to repay their loans to the broker dealers and the other non-bank financial institutions, then they can default, and then we can have a string of financial institutions collapsing. We also potentially have fire sales, even if we don't get to the point of sort of a collapse immediately. And what fire sales means is if you've got to repay a loan, you need to repay it quickly, you're going to have to start selling off assets. And you might sell off tech stocks, and that will push down the tech stock prices even further, or you might start selling off other kinds of assets as well. And so that's how this infects other kinds of financial asset markets. So if you've got everybody selling, everybody driving the prices down, people unable to meet margin calls or otherwise repay their loans, then suddenly you start to see financial institutions collapsing. And as Oscar pointed out, all of this fundamentally gets traced back to banks, right? A lot of the activity has migrated out of banks where it's less regulated, but the buck essentially stops with the banks. And when banks can't lend, that's when we get a financial crisis. And we've talked about financial crises. We haven't talked about what that really means. For people with assets, we've talked about what it means. Oscar, if you have mentioned that if you have any kind of financial asset, it's going to take a hit in a financial crisis. But half of Americans have no such assets. They, however, get hurt the worst of all, typically in financial crises, if 2008 is anything to go by, because you get a recession, a big one. And people who have done longitudinal studies on the damage created by bubbles say the more leverage that is involved in creating the bubble, the worse the financial crisis and the recession that follows it are. So we're talking people losing their jobs, We're talking about people's house prices cratering. We're talking about situations where petty crime goes up as people just try and survive. We're talking about people foregoing preventative medical care because they can't afford it. It sows the seeds for political unrest. I mean, these are the kinds of things that financial crises deliver. And as Oscar already alluded to, we're already in a pretty fragile spot on a lot of those things already. So, when the 2008 crisis hit, it hit into a society that was in a much better position to, frankly, to cope with it than we are today. And I think that's something that should make us all extremely nervous.
Thank you for the response, Professor Allen. And it is indeed nervous making. That is horrifying. So I'd love to get your sense on of what can be done to prevent or limit the harms of a crisis.
Yeah, I mean, so 2008 and its aftermath made it painfully clear that relying only on interest rate policy and bailouts after the fact is going to be an incomplete solution to a financial crisis. I would also point out that those kinds of responses end up sowing the seeds for the next crisis as people pour money into risky investments. So in the prolonged period of low interest rate after 2008, we had people seeking for yield, we call it, looking for investments that are risky and will generate some return. And so that props up the growth of risky asset classes in the wake of a financial crisis. So one of the greatest beneficiaries of low interest rates post-2008 has been the venture capital industry. The venture capital industry that built the crypto industry, carried out the run on Silicon Valley Bank and sparked the 2023 regional banking panic. And we can now add feeding the AI bubble to that sort of list of achievements. So we need to be very wary of just taking an ex post approach to these kinds of financial instability. Instead, we need interventions before crises occur. Financial systems, it's not rocket science, they can be made more robust to all shocks by limiting leverage. We can also make financial systems more robust by increasing supervisory focus on emerging risks. Unfortunately, the Trump administration is going in precisely the wrong direction. Even though insufficient supervision was a big cause of the 2008 crisis and also the regional banking crisis in 2023, the Federal Reserve Vice Chair for Supervision, Mickey Bowman, just announced plans to cut 30% of the Fed's supervision division. Limits on leverage that we have already are being rolled back in a death by 1,000 cuts that Americans for Financial Reform has highlighted in some of its publications, which are well worth reading. So the most high profile of these is probably the changes to the enhanced supplementary leverage ratio, which will allow the largest banks to take on more leverage. But there's many other steps afoot to increase leverage in the system. So unfortunately, we're going in precisely the wrong direction. And because all the ex-ante regulation that we had, which wasn't enough, but was better than nothing, and it's being rolled back, bailouts are where we appear to be headed. And I expect that it will be much more skewed than 2008 in favor of protecting the elite at the expense of the many. The Trump administration has been characterized by crony capitalism. David Sachs of the PayPal mafia, so rose to prominence with Elon Musk and Peter Thiel, for example. He is in the White House directing AI and crypto policy. We've seen top tech CEOs in pole position at Trump's inauguration. They're funding his ballroom. And so the risk that I'm worried about so many things, but the risk that's sort of preoccupying me at the moment is, even if this tech doesn't deliver, even if there's every reason for this bubble to pop, is it going to essentially be kept on life support by the Trump administration in a way that benefits the industry and hurts the rest of us? So there's been some mixed messaging from OpenAI lately about government bailouts. The CFO recently said that the company may want a bailout from the federal government. Then the head of OpenAI, Sam Altman, walked that back. But to be clear, bailouts would be not new, but sort of a continuation of a trend. OpenAI already benefits from a lot of government support. So Silicon Valley writ large benefits enormously from all kinds of public subsidies. And if you're interested in learning more, I published a book online this summer called Fintech Dystopia. Chapter 8 is called Silicon Valley Welfare Queen. So the subsidies I focus on the most in the book are dispensations from the laws that others in the market have to play by. So these legal dispensations can prop up tech businesses that are too lackluster to succeed on their own. So I guess all of that is a long way of saying that even without a bailout, Silicon Valley sponsored AI super PACs are gearing up to repeat crypto's playbook from the midterms. They're looking for regulatory moratoria that prevent states from regulating AI. So there will be legal interventions to prop up this industry. I don't think it's going to be enough necessarily to stave off the financial bubble bursting, but the fallout of that will fall on all of us, and I suspect that the industry will come out of it just fine.
Oh, thank you for that answer. That is disturbing. So, you talked about some of the risk that we're facing, and if we end up with a burst bubble and widening implications, the right policy tools, it sounds like, are going to be around capping leverage. Are there other pieces that you'd recommend?
I mean, I think strong supervision is really important as well. We've seen time and time again that when regulators aren't attuned to developing risks, sorry, supervisors, sorry, who are a type of regulator, aren't attuned to developing risks, then things slip through the cracks, because there are plenty of things that supervisors can trigger in terms of regulation as they notice developing risks, but they have to be paying attention to those developing risks, and they can't pay attention if they are stretched too thin, and that's where we're headed. But I think, yeah, I think increased supervision and significantly improved leverage regulation could help out a lot. It's just not where we're headed.
Excellent. Thank you both. And I'd like to get some. Oscar, would you like to add anything to that before we turn to audience questions?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Yeah, so the other thing I would point to is to try to, strengthen public markets as opposed to private markets, and try to get a lot of these companies out of the shadows and into a more, comprehensive regulatory regime and disclosure regime where there is more transparency, more investor protection, where, capital can be more efficiently allocated and avoid wasteful speculation and fraud. And um and yeah, just doubling down on the regulators and the supervisors. There are, the rules are in the books, or, at least there are still a lot of rules in the books. But we need to have the right personnel, right? And right now what we have is just not the right people. Is the just the industry watching out, industry insiders watching out for themselves, and just Trump cronies doing his political bidding.
Thank you both. So again, really grateful for Professor Hilary J. Allen, Oscar Valdés Viera for the answers to my questions. We're now going to turn to some audience questions, and Oscar, you sort of just hit on one of the questions from the audience, which is around what regulations of AI technology you recommend, and more specifically now, because you both addressed that, are any likely to be enacted? So and it sounds to you like that you're saying not right now. Is that an accurate assessment?
I, don't want to be, well, honestly, my expertise is not on the AI regulation side. I, feel more comfortable talking about the financial regulations, and, going back to what Professor Allen was saying, we could have more regulations on leverage and capital requirements for banks, and, try to bring the companies that do a lot of the private lending out of the shadow banking, and, have more cautions of safety. So if there are any potential losses, those are absorbed by those equity cautions by the investors themselves, and are not transmitted through the financial system. Maybe Professor Allen, you have something more on the technical side of the AI technology.
Yeah, I can jump in a little bit. I mean, it's almost impossible to be an expert in AI regulation because AI can be used in so many different contexts. And so the key thing to remember here is that this technology isn't magic. And if you are in a space that is already regulated, we could just enforce the regulation. So the CFPB, for example, under the Biden administration, did great work regulating the use of AI tools when they were making credit decisions to ensure that the COA was, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act was being complied with. And they said, look, we don't care what tool you're using, you still have to comply with the law. And I think that is the right attitude with AI. And frankly, if, as I already alluded to, if we actually enforced copyright law against these AI companies, and if we also enforced environmental permitting regarding data center building, then I'm not sure that this industry could exist. So as Oscar alluded to, it's the rules are often there. It's the will to enforce them that's missing. And part of that, again, ties back to the narrative. People just don't want to look like they're blocking innovation. But you know what? Not all innovation's good.
Thank you. And a follow-up question from a different audience member for both of you. Does it matter that much of the debt financing for AI investment is coming from outside the country, including SoftBank and Saudi wealth funds?
So the national security angle on all of this is very interesting. I mean, another part of the narrative, which I didn't touch on, is that there's this sense that we need to beat China to AI without sort of thinking about what beat means. Like, does beat mean eliminate all the jobs for your country? Like, is that the goal? Like, it's such an amorphous, like, we need to beat, but it is impossible to disentangle this conversation, honestly, from national security conversations. And again, another sort of externality that I didn't talk about is surveillance. So a lot of these companies are doing a lot of surveillance and then working AI on that. So Palantir, for example, is the leader in that. So when you start to think about sort of surveillance and weapons and all of those things being AI driven, and then having AI companies answer to people outside of the country, then that potentially does raise national security issues. That's getting a little bit out of my bailiwick, though.
Fair enough. Thank you. Thank you. Anything you have to add there, Oscar?
Yeah, not really sure. It matters where it's coming from. It also matters where where the funds are sitting, where these loans are sitting, where the balance sheets are, and a lot of that is just staying here. So, and like I said, a lot of it is being repackaged in ways that remind us of 2008. Putting back into mortgage-backed securities. In this case, commercial mortgage-backed securities, and other financial products that then sit in insurance companies and in other companies in the financial system.
All right, thank you. So I'm going to ask another question from the audience. And Professor Allen, you've hinted at some of this answer, addressed some of this answer a bit. The question is, since tech and crypto companies paid an enormous amount of money to Trump's election campaign, won't they find some way to prevent an AO or crypto crash in the short term? And you've mentioned a bit about the administration itself perhaps propping up the system. Would love to hear you talk a little bit more about, address that question, a little bit more about what propping up the system, sort of what the long-term ramifications are of letting this of sort of keeping the bubble falsely whole.
Yeah, so I mean, so many of the fintech business models, crypto included, really their distinguishing feature is not their technology, right? Their technology is not what they're succeeding on. They're succeeding on by virtue of the fact that they play outside the regulated perimeter and therefore have competitive advantages. Right. So we've got a situation where already these companies are benefiting enormously from special legal treatment that allows them to succeed, even if their technology doesn't live up to the hype, which, as I said, for both crypto and AI, it's really just not. So that begs the question of, how far that can they go propping this stuff up, right? So, with crypto, we've seen they've been changing rules to make it easier to integrate crypto with the rest of the financial system to create more of a market for assets, which are essentially Ponzi-like. We've seen talk of what are they called? Bitcoin reserve, strategic Bitcoin reserves, where basically the government will buy up a bunch of crypto to provide support for, again, what is a sort of a fundamentally a Ponzi-like asset. So what will it look like for AI? As I said, that they're already angling for the special legal treatment. Until the very last minute, the one big beautiful bill, or whatever we're calling it, had a moratorium that said that no state could regulate AI, period, for 10 years, which is insane. It was removed at the very last minute, but there are absolutely a whole bunch of attempts to, again, create this unregulated playground for it to succeed in, which, on the understanding that it couldn't succeed in a fully regulated scenario. And so, we're seeing, I think Ted Cruz has a AI sandbox bill, and we're seeing more and more pushes for moratoriums on state regulation. So that's part of what it could look like, but it could be a bit like the strategic Bitcoin reserve. Maybe the government just ends up buying all the shares in these corporations, and we end up being the bag holders. I mean, we've seen the Trump administration likes to buy stakes in companies. I wouldn't rule that out. So I don't know exactly what it's going to look like, but it does seem clear that everyday people will end up the bag holders.
I think that yeah, they would absolutely try to prevent the crash or push it, back as far as they can. And just to thinking back to a couple of things Professor Allen was saying earlier, if you frame this, if the narrative is about national security, about beating China, for example, it almost becomes a necessity, right? Like if that's what we're said, what is sold, and or if that's what policymakers buy, then obviously they're going to step in and they're going to try to prevent this from crashing. And then the other thing is just these companies like OpenAI are positioning themselves as too big to fail, and they are so embedded in the infrastructure. And I'm talking about now financial infrastructure, that if a lot of what we've been saying today is right, then they're almost too big to fail. They're almost going to be by necessity. Like if pension funds are on the hook, if jobs are on the hook, if a collapse of the magnitude of 2008, or even something like a Great Depression is on the horizon, then yeah, they're going to have to be bailed out. And also thinking about how this administration works, they might very well be happy with just pushing the can down the road to the next administration, and just calling it a success for them, and even though the problems are still there.
Thank you. Given given the precarity of this model, what would you suggest investors do with their savings at this point? And this is a question for both of you.
If I knew, I would have done it. I mean, I think Keynes's quote is always a good one, which is that the markets can stay irrational longer than you and I can stay solvent. So sort of trying to time the bubble is a fool's errand. And I don't even know where the thing about a financial crisis is that it is systemic. You've got fire sales resulting from people selling off, these Magnificent Seven stocks. People are going to start selling off other assets as well. There's rarely any place to hide during a systemic financial crisis, because everything ends up correlated to some degree in a crisis. So I don't have any good ideas. Maybe Oscar does.
I definitely don't have any investment advice. I agree. Trying to time the market is not a good idea, or trying to pick individual stocks also doesn't sound like a great idea to me. But again, I'm not an investment professional and don't wanna give investment advice here.
Fair enough. Thank you. Thank you. Oscar, you feel free to address this question after Professor Allen if you have more insights. But Professor Allen, you wrote an article in Project Syndicate where you pointed out that U.S. financial regulators continue to permit, and you mentioned today, continue to permit the expansion of leverage and are even greenlighting the integration of traditional financial markets with crypto markets and these sort of non-banking entities. So, if you could advise regulators right now, what would be the most urgent steps that they could take to reduce the systemic risks that you've outlined?
I mean, I think halt on all attempts to peel back restrictions on leverage. At the very least, maintain the status quo on leverage regulation, ideally beef it up to require all of these entities to have more equity funding. I mean, but Oscar raised an important point earlier, which is that more and more financial activity has migrated outside of the traditional banking system where it's harder to rein in leverage because they're not necessarily the regulatory tools to do so. So if I had a magic wand, what I'd like to see is, a restructured regulatory system where all financial institutions were sort of regulated, were under the auspices of people who had the power to do prudential regulation and to limit leverage where they saw it. But I guess we've got the reverse of whatever my magic wand is, to the extent that there are, and I should be clear, personnel is policy. And as Oscar alluded to, we've got very different people in charge of the regulatory agencies than we did a year ago. And I don't think that they're committed to reining in leverage, but the staff of these agencies a lot of them are very committed public servants. And to the extent that they have any ability to prevent the rollback of these kinds of rules to prevent leverage from growing, I would really urge them to do it.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would double down that none of this is inevitable. It's just an accumulation of choices, policy choices, and the tools are there, and it is preventable.
Oscar, thank you for that. That's an excellent note to end on, that we can intervene, we can stop this. We're at just about at the very last moment of our time, so we can't take any more questions. But many thanks to those of you who put them in the chat and the Q&A, and for those who submitted questions in advance. And most of all, really just want to express deep gratitude for Professor Hilary J. Allen of American University's Washington College of Law, and AFREF's own Oscar Valdés Viera, the private equity and capital markets policy analyst. Really appreciate your time and really appreciate your being the inaugural speakers and for AFREF's new speaker series. So thank you again. Appreciate your guidance, and we look forward to following your work outside in the world.